Welcome to this webinar in leading during a crisis. So let's get right into it. So my name is Matt Brady. I'm from Huntsville, Alabama. I used to be a recon helicopter pilot. I was 18 years active in the Army. Flew special operations in both Iraq and Afghanistan and commanded units in both countries as well. I was also the air commander during an operation called Operation Red Wings, which we'll get into in just a little bit. That was my crisis. It'll form the basis for this. Graduated from West Point. I have a master's in philosophy and military strategy. And I also received an MBA from what our president here at Afterburner calls the University of Texas of the North, otherwise known as Harvard Business School, and was able to also work at Airbnb during my internship during first and second year there at business school. So let's talk about the agenda. We're going to talk a little bit about Operation Red Wings, what happened before that crisis, what happened during, and then what happened after. And we'll draw out some generalized lessons learned that I took from this experience that I really am excited to share with everyone on the call. So the objective of this webinar is to give you a better understanding of how the way we approach and handle crises can give us a competitive advantage in our world, business world, your personal lives, in your community, and in many different ways. So to sort of frame the discussion, I wanted to share with you a military story from a few years ago that took place in a small valley in northeastern Afghanistan called the Korengal. So most of you know who Marcus Luttrell is. He's the Navy SEAL who is the lone survivor of one of the deadliest battles in special operations history. Well, I had the honor of inserting Marcus and his team on my helicopter into that mission, and we were tasked with getting him back out as well. So I'm going to give you my perspective of that event as it relates to crisis management. So this was my first deployment to Afghanistan. It was also my first deployment with this unit, the Night Stalkers, a nighttime helicopter unit known for taking on high-risk missions with national security impact. So if you see movies like Black Hawk Down, Zero Dark 30, you know, when people joke about little black helicopters coming and getting them, that's these guys. So I joined them as a brand new platoon leader or an officer tasked with the employment of 2 to 4 helicopters and associated crews and equipment. My boss was a man by the name of Steve Reich, and he was a major or an executive VP level in charge of not only my platoon and my sister platoon, but the rest of the unit, about 100 men, known to us as Bravo 3. So this was the pinnacle of Army Special Operations. These pilots and crew members were highly experienced, very proficient. They demanded the best from each other and their leaders. So I had a lot of pressure. There were a lot of expectations. I felt obligated to learn the ropes quickly and earn my place in the organization. So to give you an example of what Afghanistan looks like, it's a striking balance between breathtakingly beautiful mountain peaks and desolate landscapes. It's really challenging to fly here, especially helicopters. So helicopters, to give you an idea, they stay in the air by swinging a big metal blade around and striking, you know, dense air, especially at sea level, with a lot of force. Now, as you get higher in altitude, that air becomes thinner, and it requires a lot more force and energy to keep that helicopter in the air. It becomes very unstable. Now, the most predominant mountain range in Afghanistan, the Hindu Kush, soars to 14,000 feet and above, so even the most powerful helicopters in the world struggle to stay aloft at those heights. My helicopter, the Chinook, felt like a toy at those altitudes. So what happened? Well, about 3 weeks after I arrived in Afghanistan, a Navy SEAL by the name of Mike McGreevy walked into our mission planning room and started asking me about a mission codenamed Operation Red Wings. Still new to the organization, I told him I was unfamiliar and asked if he could walk me through the concept a little bit. So he pointed to a small valley on the map on the wall and described how a man named Ahmad Shah had been terrorizing the local communities and coalition bases nearby. The only way to get to him, I explained, was to helicopter 4 SEALs behind their lines to find where he was hiding. Sounds like a fairly straightforward reconnaissance mission for the Night Stalkers, and it was one in which Major Reich was eager to execute since he wanted me to get some more missions under my belt and develop me a little bit more professionally and tactically. So we planned, briefed, prepped, and loaded the SEALs on our aircraft, flew them behind the lines under cover of darkness into the peaks of the Hindu Kush, and I'll tell you, it seemed like our helicopter climbed up these mountains forever. up to 9,500 feet. I still feel the chill of that mountain air and the smell of the freshly cut pines as we inch closer to the Korengal. And as we fought to bring that helicopter to a hover, we let a rope out the back and watched all 4 SEALs slide down. Marcus gave us a thumbs up when he reached the ground safely, and off we flew back to base to reset for the next day's mission. 8 hours later, however, one of my men came running into the ops center to tell me that Marcus and his team were spotted and ambushed by a numerically superior force. So fighting for their lives, we knew what we had to do. So my platoon and I loaded the helicopter again to bring them right back out. And as my crew and I started up our helicopter to rescue these SEALs, I felt a tap on my shoulder, and I look around and it's Major Steve Reich, my boss. He said, "Matt, I know you just put those SEALs in there, but I'm going to take this one. You sit this one out, back up in the ops center." Now, to put that in perspective, that's kind of like a football coach calling a timeout right before the ball is snapped, running over to the quarterback and saying, "Hey, how about I take this one? You go ahead, right? You take a knee on the sidelines. Take a break." I was furious. Well, if you've seen the movie or read the book Lone Survivor, you know how this unfolds, right? So as the title suggests, Marcus is the only one to survive the hours-long battle, and my helicopter, along with Major Reich, my platoon sergeant, and much of my platoon were shot down and killed while they attempted a daring rescue. This was a tragic day, not only for the special ops community and the country, but obviously for the family and the loved ones of those 19 SEALs and Night Stalkers who gave the last full measure of devotion. Both organizations were swiftly and unexpectedly without leadership, thrown into confusion and uncertainty, and missing men behind enemy lines while facing an emboldened enemy. So now what do you do? Now I know what you're thinking, "Matt, this is tragic, but I can't really relate. These are not the threats that I face. I may be facing tough circumstances like public relation challenges, stock price pressure, employee unrest, divorce, or a death in the family, but those are considerably different, right?" Not so much. I would respectfully disagree. The challenges and crises we face every day, whether personal or professional, may be less in magnitude, but are much higher in frequency than the situation I'm describing. And so in this way, frequent and seemingly small crises by comparison can have a slow and insidious effect on our confidence in ourselves, in our team, in our leadership, and ultimately in our organization's ability to make an impact. So don't doubt for a second the erosive effect of mishandled crises on our ability to execute flawlessly and accelerate performance. In other words, our everyday crises may differ in degree, but not in perceived impact or potential to destroy livelihoods and relationships. So let's get to the meat of the discussion. Let's talk about what to do before, during, and after crises. Firstly, it's important to recognize that crises are inevitable. They're the unanticipated and potentially destructive difference between where you are and where you thought you'd be. Though we may hate to admit it, Murphy says whatever can go wrong will, and at the last possible moment. So to beat Murphy at his own game, or a contemporary example, mayhem from the Allstate commercials, right? We must plan for contingencies. So like Allstate, that's all contingency planning is, right? It's insurance. It's recognizing the fact that these undesirable outcomes may eventually happen, so we need to allocate some resources to cover less than probable scenarios. In the financial world, they call this hedging, actually spending money to counter your investment thesis or what you thought would most likely happen in the marketplace. So in this situation, we planned months prior to the actions of prior to this event taking place. We practiced what we would do if we ever found ourselves in an unlikely scenario of, while flying at night, losing visual reference of terrain and other aircraft simultaneously. It turns out this crisis played out when we first attempted to reach the aircraft crash site during Red Wings. The weather was so bad, we first lost sight of the mountain we were climbing, and then all 5 helicopters lost sight of each other while in tight formation. So now you can't see anything except the cloud, the cotton ball that you're in, and you know you're about 100 feet from another helicopter and you're about 500 feet from a mountain. Thankfully, we practiced this beforehand. We all knew to climb to different and pre-specified altitudes and turn in various directions, resembling a starburst pattern. This allowed us to avoid striking the terrain and thankfully each other. So next is think like a boss, and there's a story behind this bullet. So when I was in the ops center where Steve Reich had told me to go and I was listening to the operation unfold, I heard the call come across the radio, turbine 3-3, that was the call sign of the helicopter, turbine 3-3 is down. And at that point we knew the unthinkable had happened. And as I sat there and I started to kind of channelize on the computer in front of me, out of the corner of my eye I saw one of my sergeants saying something, but I just couldn't make out the words. And finally I looked over at him to hear what he was saying, and he was saying, "What do we do now?" And I didn't know why he was asking me. But then I realized that, you know, in the military, if you're the senior ranking officer in any situation or organization, you're in charge. Well, in this situation, there were no officers left. So by default, I became the Bravo 3 commander. Now remember, not only am I new to Afghanistan and the aircraft, I'm new to this organization. I'm a brand new captain. I'm the junior most commissioned officer in this entire battalion. Regardless, I had to act in one of the most senior positions in the 1,000-man force, a task for which I was totally and completely unprepared. To be transparent, I just was not ready for this. I had not spent a considerable and requisite amount of time thinking like the Bravo 3 commander or asking what would Steve do in this situation. So on top of the mayhem and the confusion swirling around us, I now had to use valuable time and energy playing catch-up and learning this new role on the fly. This was not ideal for my unit. They needed and deserved someone ready to lead in an instant, no time to learn the ropes. Here's my lesson learned on this one. Sometimes you don't control when you'll be needed to step up to a stretch role or make decisions on behalf of the organization when you thought you'd still be at an apprenticeship level. Don't be caught flat-footed when your team needs you most. Think through how you might handle difficult situations. And don't be afraid to extract logic and reasoning from your boss's decision-making processes for your own professional development. It might just be what your team needs in a crisis. In the end, I was able to play catch-up reasonably well and lead Bravo 3 back into the Korengal. But that was due in very large part to the training and the standards that were already in place. We already had a strong culture of leaning in and executing tasks to a high standard of excellence. The flywheel was already spinning before I even had to say a word or make a single decision as the new commander. Related to that, if you're in a prominent and critical leadership position, make sure you're reaching down. Make sure you're developing 2 levels down. In other words, mentor your direct reports. This ensures mid and lower level leaders are receiving the training and expert advice they need for professional growth and providing a common set of discussions and leaders to discuss for middle and senior management to focus on for their own team gelling and professional development. Lastly, before crises happen, rehearse contingencies to build muscle memory in the organization. Just like the starburst maneuver I alluded to when losing visual reference of the mountains and the aircraft around me, rehearsals develop crucial mind and muscle memory for when you need training to kick in. So now let's talk about what happens when you inevitably find yourself in the middle of a crisis. As Steve Reich, my boss during Red Wings, would often say, wherever you go, there you are. It's one of my favorite quotes. And what he meant by that was, don't waste your time looking for people or events to blame for your circumstances. It's irrelevant. You're in it, and you've got to act. The first lesson here is there's a difference between execution rhythm and execution tempo. Hopefully by now you've set up in your organization an effective rhythm or pattern of execution in your organization that's a collection of activities that occur at predictable points in time to keep execution on track. That rhythm should stay the same. Jamie Dimon has a great way of phrasing this and framing this when he talks about his actions at JPMorgan Chase during the financial crisis. You've already proven the habits in your organization are worthwhile. Keep those habits, just accelerate them, speed them up. What should change, however, is the execution tempo, the frequency of those rhythmic activities. For example, our force would routinely communicate with higher headquarters and conduct all-hands meetings once in the morning and once at night. Now, with a crisis on our hands, we accelerated these meetings to twice in the morning and twice at night and just widened the net of the audience to include the people in the Pentagon that need to be in on the meetings and the decisions that were being made, and some other stakeholders as well that started to flood into the situation. So this allowed us to manage the increased demand for information and decision-making without sacrificing proven patterns of behavior in the name of crisis management. In short, our organization operated more effectively because we stuck to the things that worked and didn't try to reinvent standard operating procedures on the fly. Now, obviously there are some things that didn't work, and that's most likely why you're in a crisis, right? Maybe it was external threats you weren't anticipating, or a shift in environmental factors in the market or the customer base. Maybe it was the way we implemented or failed to implement internal controls. The point is, you've got to start piecing together this new situation you find yourself in. A former Secretary of Defense once famously described known and unknowns in Iraq. Simply put, what he meant was there were things that we know and that we think we know, and there are those pieces of information we need to find out. Taking a step back from this situation was critical for us. As we prepared to go back into the Korengal to find our guys, we needed to build an objective list of new facts on the ground to try and isolate where the changes had occurred and what we might have missed. Often crises invite a deluge of enticing yet erroneous pieces of information, and they often flood into the situation. Rumors, half-baked theories, incomplete information. It's important to take a step back and validate the information you're receiving and chart out the information you're lacking but are critical to you getting back on track. Now, one other point is about risk prioritization. Now, I spoke a little bit about the situation when we had to starburst, away from that mountain when we lost sight of each other. Well, when we landed again, I had a decision to make. Do I send all 5 helicopters back up the mountain and again try to rescue all of our guys? And at this point, we didn't know if they were alive or not. Or do we wait for the weather to pass, which presented a clear and present risk to our force? So which risk do you go with? They're both pretty bad. They're both fairly significant. Risk injuring or killing more people, or do we risk leaving our friends and comrades and brothers in arms on this mountain, and if they're in dire need of help, not being able to get them that help? So what I decided to do is wait about 24 hours to attempt it again and wait for the weather to pass and for the darkness to descend again so we could try to go back in under cover of darkness. I didn't want to risk more injury, more death. The guys were already fairly rattled from the maneuver we had to execute, and so I didn't want to risk the force any more than we already had. I had to rely on the training and standards and professionalism of that downed crew. If they were alive, I needed them to rely on those skills and that initiative. And knowing that we had selected so rigorously for this organization, I had to rely that is what they would rely on. So in a crisis, if you're not weighing one risk against another risk and accepting the one you can live with, then you're not getting the right information. Someone is making that organizational decision for you somewhere in the hierarchy. Find out who it is, and if they're capable and you trust that individual, continue to power down those decision-making responsibilities. But just remember, if you're not getting one risk versus another risk and hearing about that, you're probably not getting good information. Now, it might not be lost on your competition that you're facing a crisis, and this might be their chance to gain an advantage. When our helicopter went down, this was tremendously emboldening to our enemy. They had momentum, and they weren't going to squander the opportunity to try to knock us further off balance. At this point, it's important to think, okay, if I were on the other side, how would I take advantage of me in this situation? It's a way of red teaming your decision-making process to ensure you're covering your flanks as you get back on your feet. In Red Wings, our enemy knew we'd come back for our men. It was a value, it was a principle, and they positioned themselves accordingly. In your world, maybe your competition wants to exacerbate your PR crisis by providing more video evidence of poor customer service, or communicating this to your organization helps everyone play a part in stabilizing the situation and denying your competition the advantage that they're seeking. Lastly, be on the lookout for task saturation. Task saturation, we like to say, is the perception of the reality that there's too much to do, not enough time, tools, or resources to get them all done. Everyone handles crises differently. Some people laser focus on the wrong tasks to the detriment of others. I laser focused on the screen in front of me, if you remember, while people were trying to communicate with me. So during my crisis, for instance, we had one soldier who would continuously format and reformat slides in preparation for our numerous meetings and Skype calls. It was his way of dealing with the situation. And although it probably offered him a sense of control in a very chaotic situation, it wasn't what the organization needed. You've got to make a point of looking around and seeing who might need mutual support. Crises are oftentimes an all-hands-on-deck situation, and you can't afford to lose your best players to this insidious production trap. During crises, you've got to maintain your edge and that of your leaders. It does no good to wear yourself down to demonstrate commitment or resolve to your team. They need leadership in these situations, not a martyr. During World War II, after General Eisenhower gave the official order to begin the Allied assault on Normandy, he promptly excused himself and he went to sleep. Now you might be wondering, how can you go to sleep during such an important and pivotal time? Ike knew his value to the Allies was his ability to lead with a calm and clear mind, not his ability to go without sleep and sustenance for long periods of time. Make sure you understand your value during a crisis and what you must do to maintain that edge. One of the best decisions I made during my crisis was to ask a trusted mentor what he would do in my situation. I was able to recognize that my decision-making abilities might be impaired because of the stress and the gravity of the situation, and a somewhat unbiased perspective might help me evaluate my decisions in a different light. Stress, uncertainty, fatigue, they all have an impact on our ability to think. Getting a second pair of eyes was incredibly important. And so one word on advice, if I can give some advice on advice, I have found it much easier and much more effective to ask for advice from a trusted source when I frame it in terms of them and not in terms of me. So for example, instead of asking, what should I do in this situation? When you do that, sometimes there's a tendency to create an expectation in the mind of the advice giver that their advice will be taken. Instead, consider asking, what would you do in this situation given these circumstances? This way, you're objectively gathering data points versus risking a valued relationship by, in the end, maybe not taking the advice that they're suggesting. So, and don't be too proud to reach out for support when you need it. Friends, family, trusted coworkers all want to see you succeed. Let them help. Finally, when a crisis passes, and it will, don't forget to debrief. And do that now, not during execution. Execution is not time to be retrospective. But after it's over, this crisis may not happen to you in its exact form in the future, but some variant will happen again. Ensure you're talking about this eventuality with the team and how important it is to learn from these events. Dig deep into the causes and the root causes of not only the crisis itself, but how you handled it. What will we do differently next time? What kind of a checklist or concrete action steps can we create the next time something similar happens? Crises are rare opportunities to really understand the capabilities and limitations of your organization. Don't miss that opportunity for learning and growth. Finally, ensure that you use this as a time to heal. There will undoubtedly be a portion of your organization who suffer disproportionately. Take time to talk through the impact with these folks, whether they're employees, family members, or customers who felt the ramifications most. How you treat the most vulnerable and affected members of your organization and your ecosystem will help define the character of your team moving forward the next time you find yourself in a crisis. Always remember, here are the takeaways. Be proactive. Find out and determine what you know, what you don't know, and what you need to know to move that crisis forward and ultimately eliminate and move through the crisis. Wherever you go, there you are. It may be unfair, it may not be what you expected, but the time is here and now to execute, and your team's counting on you. Always ask for another opinion. Ask multiple people what they would do in your situation, not what should you do. And when you're through it, don't let it go to waste. Don't let that crisis happen again with a blank playbook. Make sure we're learning from those lessons learned, the causes and the root causes of how it happened in the first place, but more importantly, how we got through it to the other side. At this point, I would love to take questions, so we're going to turn it over to the audience. Ansley, what kind of questions do we have?
Thank you, Matt. Our first question, what do you think is the most common crisis business teams will run into?
Yeah, so I think what we've seen here at Afterburner and in our military careers, the most common crisis is a slow onset crisis of poor socialization of new employees. Now let me just kind of explain what I mean by that. Every company, every organization has a culture that they hope everyone adopts. But a lot of times, companies and organizations don't have a clear plan for how you're going to instill and communicate that culture into new hires. When new hires come on board, they're going to learn what your company values, what your organization values, whether you tell them or not. And that's going to be through socialization of peers, of first-line managers, or at the executive level. Someone's going to get a hold of them and show them or tell them what's important to your organization. So the biggest crisis that I see organizations face is a culture problem because they never had a clear plan to talk about what they value, what they believe in, what's important to them, what they must do, what they'll never do, in very clear black and white terms to people that come on board. And they end up getting a culture that's been instituted through informal social means and not through a regimented, rigorous, central method.
How do you keep yourself as an individual ready to meet crises when they happen?
So a couple of ideas here, and I can't stress this enough, and yes, I've spent a lot of time in the military, and that's not where this is coming from. Lots of business leaders agree with me. You've got to stay in shape, and you've got to maintain a habit of regularly getting outside, getting to the gym, increasing your ability to, really increasing your strength, your health, your ability to, your stamina, essentially. When crises happen, sometimes these turn into all-nighters. You've got to have the stamina, the physical stamina, to absorb, a lot of new information, synthesize that information into potential courses of action, potential solutions. You've got to wait up potentially, for other time zones to weigh in with their input into the problem based on where this is all happening. So your ability to deal with a crisis physically has gives a competitive advantage to business leaders when they're trying to get through the situation and remain competitive mentally. So I can't stress enough the importance of physical fitness. And I'd say the second thing is just kind of going back to the thinking like a boss. When your leaders, when your organization needs you most, a lot of times it's when you have to step into a role that you weren't ready for, that you weren't prepared for. Take some time to be a mentee. Seek out that information and that mentorship from those your organization that you're interested in, that eventually you want to grow into, and don't wait for them to reach down. Be very proactive about reaching up, learning the ropes, so that when you're needed in a crisis, when somebody is needed in a crisis, you're the first person that people turn to.
How do you overcome strong personality conflicts? Example, too many leaders lacking ability to follow.
Yeah, so this is really a tough one. How do you ensure that the people on your team are aligned to the same objective and are aligned to the same, the same high definition destination? And then how do you deal with it when they're not? It really goes to, when you're facing this kind of an interpersonal conflict, nothing gets resolved by gossip. Nothing gets resolved by trying to build allegiances and trying to find like-minded individuals about how hard someone is, how difficult someone is to deal with and how they're not pulling their weight. That only further fractures the organization. It makes them weaker in a time of crisis. There's no better medicine for interpersonal conflict than just facing the music, talking to that person, having it out. Maybe there's some yelling involved, maybe there's some foot stomping, but you've got to get some understanding about why you're not seeing the issue or the crisis in the same way. There's got to be that culture of respectful truth over the artificial harmony that a lot of times breeds that really insidious and toxic environment in the workplace. So establish a habit of debriefing, establish a habit of continuously engaging and communicating with people, especially with those you don't agree. And when you establish that pattern and that habit and that culture, you'll find that the folks that are still difficult to deal with, they self-select. That's not an organization they want to be a part of, and oftentimes they'll head for the door and do that work for you.
Along with your physical stamina, how else can you manage your stress?
So it's a really good question. I would say, stress management can be done in a number of different ways. The way I like to manage the stress is I will carve out and I will allocate time on my calendar, and it's a block of an hour and a half on Outlook, where I take a step back and I try to visualize how the event could unfold in different ways. I try to visualize a really difficult conversation I'm going to have with someone, and just going through that drill and simulating what that's going to be like in your mind tends to take some of that anxiety out of the situation, that anxiety that oftentimes creates that stress. Another way to relieve stress and to really de-escalate stressful situations, and this kind of goes back to the whole interpersonal conflict part of that last question. When you're having a difficult situation and you're in a stressful situation and then someone else is contributing to that, you're not able to get through to each other, when you approach them, it's really important to say, start with the objective, start with the end in mind. Say, look, this is the reason I want to have this conversation. I want to be aligned with you. I want to get through this crisis with you, and I want us to remain effective coworkers. And so for that reason, that's why I want to bring up something you said, something you did, something I did that made you react a certain way, and talk through why you reacted or I reacted the way that we did. So starting with the end in mind and that objective up front and verbalizing that visualization a lot of times reduces that anxiety immediately and puts people less on the defensive and more in a place where they truly do believe that you want to be successful together.
Is there an early warning system that businesses can use to detect crises early?
Well, the only system I can really think of to detect crises would be, what I like to call the all-hands stand-up meeting. And I took this page out of the playbook of General Stanley McChrystal, who I'm sure his name rings a bell. I had a chance to work for him overseas in Afghanistan at the Joint Special Operations Command. And what he would do, which I've since adopted, is instead of just having a meeting with 4 or 5 of his direct reports and talk about the problems and issues of the day or the week or the month or the quarter, and then that eventually trickling down to the tactical level where all the problems were occurring and the best information was anyway, he expanded that to include thousands of people on a conference call at one time during the day, and it would last for about an hour and a half. That way, by having that massive worldwide meeting, the problems and issues and the leading indicators of those crises could be aired immediately for everyone to see. And you really had to get past that cultural friction of someone's boss or boss's boss finding out, at the same time that their boss finds out on this massive call. You can imagine the situation of bringing up an issue or a challenge that you hadn't even told your boss about yet your boss 5 levels up is hearing about it for the first time at the same time as your manager. That can be contentious if you've laid that groundwork and laid that expectation and socialized that idea and that concept far enough in advance. That can become the norm, and that's the best technique that I have seen for really, getting to the edge of those crises, getting down to the grassroots, to the tactical level, and seeing those challenges and crises emerge in their most in their most dormant or beginning stages before they really start to spiral out of control. So I can't emphasize that communication piece enough. Not just communicating frequently, but very, very broadly.
You mentioned rehearsal. What does that look like in the corporate environment?
So it can take a number of different forms. So the one that jumps to mind is a retail environment. So, we've got the launch of Apple, the iPhone 10 in 2023, whenever that is, right? So you've got big box stores, you've got retailers that are getting ready for that known, right? We know when the launch date is going to be. So we've got that rehearsal on the books ready to go. During that rehearsal, it's a great time to start practicing these crises, rehearsing these crises. Like, okay, what if this contingency arises? Stock out. We've got lines that exceed 50 people long. We've got connectivity issues. You can't get the devices started when they purchase them. Pre-sale, too much of the inventory. So at a retail level, it's probably clear. It's a clearer rehearsal that you can take part in. When you go up the hierarchy and you get to the executive level, it's a bit more abstract, but now you're getting into situational rehearsals. So if you're at the executive level, stock price or earnings don't reach the level that analysts expected for the quarter. What's going to happen to the stock price? If it dips 15%, how do we communicate that? How do we communicate that unanticipated scenario to our employees? How are we going to retain their faith in our long-term vision in the face of these really short-term, quarterly level outcomes? So those contingencies can be rehearsed, and everywhere in between. There are adverse effects that happen at the retail level, at the executive level, with an assortment of different audiences involved, whether it's your employees, customers, society. So each of these outcomes, each of these stakeholders can be thought about when you think about rehearsing these types of situations.
During a crisis, how do you filter out the noise that comes from all the different stakeholders now involved into useful information?
That's such a great question. So let me start with the first part of that. Stakeholders involved and how, and the level of information, the volume of information that they bring to a crisis. First of all, what I like to do is minimize the stakeholders as much as possible. I remember sitting down with the president of Arizona State University once when he first took over and had a very, crucial change management mission in front of him for that university. And about 15 very tenured senior folks walked into his office and told him what he should do with his organization, how the university should proceed in the face of declining admission rates and application rates. And he very simply would ask somebody, how are you a stakeholder in this crisis, right? How do you have a piece of skin in the game? And if they couldn't adequately explain that, they were politely and respectfully disinvited from the meeting. So you're going to see more and more stakeholders try to get involved. As the leader, you need the authority and the power to be able to limit those stakeholders to only those that are affected and only those that can help you through the crisis. So stakeholder thinning, stakeholder management is a very important part of it. When it comes, in terms of the information you're getting and weeding through all that noise, that's really where you have to have a solid team that's with you and behind you that's able to take that information, go through it in a systematic way, and then plug it into those known knowns, those unknown knowns, and where you really need to focus your efforts. So you're getting this information, let's bucket it, let's see if this is critical to our planning efforts, let's see if this is critical to getting to our high definition destination on the other side of this crisis. If it's not a known unknown that we're looking for, let's see if it's an unknown unknown. Maybe it's something that we really didn't think about searching for and it's something that might be important, so let's consider it potentially. But let's focus on those known unknowns and those known knowns. So, it's important to really start organizing that information as it comes in, and you can only do that with a reliable, motivated, and really hardworking and invested, committed team.
Preparing for the known unknowns seems like the key to preventing crisis. What are the most important questions to ask yourself and each other when preparing, in order to prepare for these upfront?
Yeah, so, when you've got a known unknown, so it's something like, look, we've got, we've got this crisis in a different region, it's a different division, we're not co-located with this other group. We really got to find out, these pieces of information, but we just don't know them yet, right? So who would know that information? So getting to those closest to the issue and closest to the problem, really reaching out and trying to get to the edge of the problem and find out who would have access to that best information, and getting them to get you that info as quickly as possible is absolutely crucial. So, it's a matter of just finding out where the experts reside, and usually it's closest to that problem, to the tactical edge, and really giving them a voice to get that information back to you.
And we have time for one more question before we close. What should we do to eliminate or minimize task saturation and others, like our team members, during a crisis?
Yeah, so task saturation is so insidious in its onset, and, it happens to everyone. Really, really difficult to do this, but, you've got to, form some kind of standard way of thinking through your tasks that you've got to do. A lot of times we call that a checklist. You can call it standard operating procedures. You can use it a card, a tool that allows you to step through the critical things that need done. So, and another technique is not only checklist building, but also, task shedding. So if you've got, 15 things that you're going to have to do in the next 30 minutes, you've really got to look around you and find out who are those trusted members, those trusted individuals on your team, your trusted peers that you can ask for help and ask to take on some of these tasks. It's important to really be able to identify that, hey, I've got too much to do right now. I really am in need of mutual support, so I've got to shed some of these tasks to those that have the capacity to take them on. So task shedding, making those checklists, ensuring that you're not laser focusing on the wrong problem, taking a step back and understanding, all right, where are we going? Where's our objective? Am I contributing to that objective, or am I just focused on something that's irrelevant? So having those check-ins routinely throughout the day, not only with you but with your team, are going to be critical in staving off and minimizing the impact of task saturation. So I think that's all we've got for right now. Thank you so much to Ansley Ankers. She is the executive producer extraordinaire for each one of these webinars. We couldn't do it without her. Don't forget to register for next month's webinar, where we'll focus on contingency plans. The link can be found in the chat box and on the screen. It's been an honor talking to everyone. Night Stalkers don't quit, NSDQ, Afterburner, and don't forget flawless execution for your organization. If you'd like us to help, please connect. Thanks so much.